In this video, we're going to explore the relationship between socialization, rationality, and risk. And just to kind of introduce what we'll be talking about, we need to think about the fact that we're living in a world of risks right now, requiring a lot of careful and rational decision making. And the problem is, individuals are not always rational, and risk is not always calculable. So this is quite a dilemma to be in. We need to make important decisions, and we have very little foundation on which to build those decisions. So ultimately, we need to think about something called a risk dialogue, which is a conversation between experts who do their very best to calculate risks at times. We'll explore when that might fall apart. And then, of course, with citizens, we need public involvement, especially since the risks are not always calculable and the rewards are not always shared. So we'll explore all these things throughout this presentation. And we're going to begin by thinking about the process of socialization, how we become individuals, and then we'll look at rationality as it relates to who we are. So socialization is the process by which we become filled with a particular culture. And it's a lifelong process. It never ends, although arguably the earlier years in life are more formidable. Children are more susceptible and like sponges for information. If you don't believe me, ask children who learn other languages how long it takes them, and you'll learn that kids have a special gift when it comes to absorbing their culture and information. So Schaeffer defines socialization as the process whereby people learn the attitudes, values, and actions appropriate to individuals as members of a particular culture, which I think is a pretty good synopsis of it all. Now, identity is the result of socialization as individuals. We become some kind of self, and that involves a collection of beliefs, values, attitudes, and behaviors held at the individual level. And identity implies some level of permanence. In other words, we're not always shifting our identity every day, although we do have some mental disorders where that's actually one of the characteristics, but that's why we call it a disorder. It's because it's abnormal. We have some level of congruency, meaning that we don't believe one thing and act differently on a consistent basis. And our identities tend to be anchored in our direct experiences. And these are all important points that they'll become clear as we go through the conversation here. So we need to look at some theories of socialization. How is it we form this identity? How do we become a self, an individual within a particular culture? And one theory is rational choice theory. That's the idea that people basically develop as little calculators, where we go through life making cognitive assessments of potential dangers or potential benefits or gains in life, and we act according to our calculations. George Homans, who invented something called social exchange theory, pointed out that a favor or gift given to somebody creates an obligation or reciprocity in the other. So even the act of giving, which seems like a selfless kind of act, is also reducible to a calculation. Now, this idea of rational choice has problems. One of its critics is an economist and psychologist named Kahneman. And Kahneman talks about type 1 and type 2 thinking. And he says most of our lives are involved with thinking fast. We basically just respond to the stimuli around us, and that means we're acting habitually. Sometimes, however, we have unusual circumstances that require us to slow down and formulate some rational thought, and that he calls type 2 thinking. And as you probably guessed it, most of our lives are operated at the level of type 1, and only occasionally do we enter into type 2. So that would immediately, as a critique, show some of the limitations of this rational choice model. Now, when it comes to research, There has been an extensive line of experiments and studies, beginning with the work of Fishbein in 1967, looking to see if people's attitudes will predict their behaviors. So in the case of the environment, if I have pro-environmental attitudes, will that mean I won't throw garbage out my window? Will that mean I'll donate money to environmental organizations? In other words, will I act in ways consistent with my attitudes? And that, of course, is a hypothesis that is derived from rational choice theory. Now, there's an alternative theory called Self-Justification Theory that also looks at attitudes and behaviors, and it hypothesizes the opposite. It says that if we do develop some kind of incongruency between our attitudes and our behaviors, that oftentimes, instead of changing our attitudes, or our behaviors will change our attitudes, which is sort of the idea of self-justification. If you ever bought something that you couldn't afford, you'll spend a lot of time trying to convince yourself why it was a good purchase, right? So rather than returning the item to the store, you try to change your attitude about it. So rational choice theory would predict exactly the opposite. So clearly we have some limits here empirically, and theoretically we have some alternatives to rational choice theory. So we're going to walk through what some of those are. Now, in a broad sense, sociologists usually start from the symbolic interactionist framework, which is a social psychological theory about how we develop a self. And it all started with George Herbert Mead, arguably influenced by people such as Charles Horton Cooley, maybe John Dewey. But essentially Mead argued that our self is composed of two parts. We have an I, which is sort of the impulsive and instinctual part of who we are, maybe the thing behind our type 1 thinking. And then there's the me, which is our socialized self, which is our self as object, where we try to see ourselves through the eye of others. And that may be closer to type 2 thinking in Kahneman's framework. And essentially the me is what we're interested in the most as sociologists. Perhaps psychologists have more to say about the I, the biological components of who we are, the impulses, the drives, the instincts, the evolution of the human being, the human body, and so forth. But as sociologists, we tend to focus more on the agents of socialization. And here, Mead points us to significant and generalized others. These are simply influential people in our lives. We begin with significant others, our family, usually our immediate family, and then we expand to others, our friends, our peer groups, to generalized others like society or my community or my organization. And Shibutani contributes the notion of reference groups. These are the groups to which we compare ourselves and when we evaluate who we are, when we're looking at ourselves as an object. In Weigart's theory, which he calls transverse interaction, he claims that the environment itself can act as an other. In other words, we evaluate our action against the reference group of the environment. It's kind of an interesting contribution to this discussion, especially as it pertains to this class. So he argues that direct interaction with the environment has a socializing effect. It helps shape our identity, and that is consistent with what we know about identity being rooted in direct experiences. So Weigart would claim if you have more experiences with nature, perhaps you're going to have more favorable views towards it as a hypothesis. Another social psychological theory, which corresponds nicely to Kahneman's type 1 thinking, I think, is the sort of habitual self, which is phenomenology, although phenomenology certainly predates Kahneman's work. It starts with the philosophy of Edmund Husserl, and then it's handed down to us through the sociology of Alfred Schutz around World War II. And essentially, what this theory says is that we go through our lives essentially on autopilot. We don't even really put any thought to what we're doing. Typically, we just kind of go on from one thing to the next based on our own routines and habits. And it's only under unusual circumstances that we are forced to wake up. Kahneman would say there we're shifting into type 2 thinking, and we evaluate our recipes and our routines, and sometimes we have to create new ones. Another theory is what we call dramaturgy, which is essentially the least psychological of all the social psychological theories, because it's based entirely on outward appearances. And essentially that means the self we have is simply an image we're trying to maintain. And the metaphor is the idea that the world is a stage and we are players, we're actors on that stage. And this idea comes to us from Irving Goffman in his book, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. And essentially the key process going on here is what he calls impression management. Every time we interact with people, we're trying to maintain an impression. We're trying to project an image, and we want people to see that image the way we're intending to project it. And then he says most of that's happening on the front stage. This is there's two stages in life, the front and the back. The back is when we give up this game of impression management, but on the front is where we are maintaining the impressions people have of us. So in this case, there's really not a whole lot of calculation going on, not even a whole lot of routine being mentioned. It's simply a self that is driven to maintain a reputation, an image that other people have of us. So reflecting on these social psychological theories, particularly going after rational choice theory, which unfortunately seems to be widely accepted by government and its policies and so forth, is a very influential theory. The notion of a cognitive fix is embraced also by organizations like environmental organizations who think the best way to change people's behavior is to start by changing their attitudes. So that's one of the beliefs of this framework. And then the other one, the best way to change people's attitudes is to present them with new information that might help to change their attitudes. And of course, there are problems with both belief 1 and belief 2 here. On the one hand, it's possible to change one's behavior without ever touching their attitudes. And essentially, the way that's done is through what Heberlein calls a structural fix, where essentially the rules are rewritten. Right? If you pass a law that says you have to wear a seatbelt, well, people may be angry about it. Their attitudes may still be against wearing seatbelts, but they're going to make it click because they're afraid of getting a ticket, as the slogan even says, right? Click it or ticket. The second point is that the nuances of identity are not really appreciated in the statement that new information can change attitudes because identities tend to be somewhat permanent and resistant to change. They're not easy to change, and therefore, when we're presented with information that contradicts our deeply held beliefs, we're likely to dismiss that information, twist it, contort it, ignore it, whatever we have to do to protect our identity. So in summary, when we consider all the different views of the self that come from these theories, the first, from rational choice theory, is this idea that we're risk calculators. And as it pertains to the environment, that means we're only going to act in ways that benefit the environment if our attitudes tell us it's a good idea. And that's usually because we made a calculation that we're going to get some kind of benefit personally from protecting the environment. The socialized self, the view given to us from symbolic interactionism, really points more to the lifelong process of socialization. So here, they would hypothesize that if you're going to care for the environment, it's because you were raised by your family, by your friends, by your reference groups, your peer groups, to value the environment and so forth. And out of that process, you formed an identity that was conducive to protecting the environment. Right, so the next, the creature of habit view, comes to us from Phenomenology. The idea that we develop recipes or routines as we float through life. And if we're thinking about the environment, without really any thought, we could be protecting or hurting the environment just based on our routine behaviors. And of course, that can be a useful piece of information, because if we can get people to develop pro-environmental routines, then they wind up protecting the environment without even any thought. So much for having to change attitudes. Finally, the actor, the view that comes to us from dramaturgical theory, suggests that we only really are going to protect the environment if we want people to see that as a part of who we are. So we're going to project an image of someone who protects the environment, and we want people to accept that impression. So of course, the question then becomes, who is more likely to want to project that? And that brings us back to the socialized self, I think, that symbolic interactionism discusses. So I think those two are compatible and complementary theories. So now we're going to think about the implications of rationality, understanding now some of the limitations of rational choice theory, and look at the implications of what it means living in a risky world, a risk society, given the limitations of rationality. And in fact, we're living in a time that can be best characterized by risk, culturally and politically. And if you flip on the TV news, you're likely to see stories that remind you of that in several different ways as you hear about GMOs, pesticides, hazardous wastes, lead in the water, dioxin, smog, cancer, heart disease, AIDS, car accidents, plane crashes. These are the headlines of daily news stories and remind us constantly how much risk we assume just by simply living in the world. Now, not all risk is the same. There are what we would call voluntary risks, and people will engage in risky behaviors knowingly. And essentially, we're willing to accept the risk as long as we know the dangers. So people will smoke, they will drive a car, they will eat fast food. All of these behaviors, of course, carry with them a potential for danger. The problem, of course, is that many risks lie outside of our comprehension. And that leads us to what Beck calls the risk society. And Beck says that as societies become more complex, our ability to comprehend and, in fact, make calculations about risk diminishes. So while voluntary risks are viewed as acceptable, it's hard to be rational if we can't calculate risks. So that would lead, if we are being rational and we can't make good calculations, to a position of precaution. We would want to take the precautionary principle seriously. So that entails essentially proving that something is safe before we engage with it. So before taking an action, we're going to assume it's dangerous, right? We're going to assume all of the risk is there and act out of precaution. So then the question arises, who has the burden of proof for establishing that something is safe or dangerous? Now, sometimes something is too complex. If you buy a pharmaceutical from a drug company, unless you have a degree in chemistry or some specialized training, you're probably not personally going to be very good at evaluating the risk of that. So that raises an important question. Now, consider all the recent pharmaceuticals that were recently removed from shelves because they had unanticipated, in other words, uncalculated risks that emerged. Right? So you buy some kind of pain reliever and you find out it causes internal bleeding or something like that. Now, was it the pharmaceutical company's job to explore those risks before putting that drug out to market? Or is it the consumer's job to have to evaluate the risk through this inductive process, as typically and unfortunately often is the case? Now, when it comes to the government, that's an important part of the discussion here, right? The government, of course, is who we look to as an interest that will protect consumers from such industrial neglect, for instance, right? Now, when it comes to the environment, that takes the shape of something called rational risk assessment, which is the current approach taken by the Environmental Protection Agency, and it's also taken a similar model used in other countries around the world. And the goal here, we're going to provide a simple understanding that is easily translated into public policy. Right, we're going to weigh the risks, we're going to weigh the pros, the cons, and so forth, and we're going to make an informed decision. Problem, of course, as we just mentioned, we can't always make good calculations, right? We can't assume that all the facts are known, and that's one of the key assumptions of this approach. Makes you question why that's the approach taken. There's a social aspect to risk that's being neglected in these rational models, and that essentially comes down to power and trust. Now, our knowledge is something that is shaped by our social relations, and we really do have to deal with powerful interests trying to twist and contort what we're learning That is the information and knowledge that we're presented with. And then we have to decide who we're going to trust, particularly when we are ourselves unqualified to judge a risk. We have to rely perhaps on scientists or on other experts. For example, if we look at the unfortunate phenomenon of Hurricane Katrina, this was defined by many as a natural disaster. Now that on the face of things doesn't seem to be a problem. Hurricanes, of course, happen. They're unpredictable. But by framing this as a natural disaster, we're ignoring the poor conditions of the levees that were in place in New Orleans, for instance, around Lake Pontchartrain. We're ignoring the human action involved in destroying swamp buffers along the Gulf Coast that might have mitigated the damage of this hurricane. And so framing natural disasters as such, we are taking the onus off of humans and placing it on nature. And now why would that happen? Now that's where power comes in. There are powerful interests, of course, that want to deny responsibility for poor preparation. In this case, it looks like the government, right, not taking necessary steps to make sure everything was up to par in protecting people from a potential hurricane. And of course, the powerful want to gain public trust so that they accept that narrative. So all of this kind of brings us to a discussion of risk dialogue. Powerful interests exist everywhere, and they frequently and deliberately want to suppress a rational dialogue of risk between citizens and scientists. Good example of that, Oprah Winfrey, acting as a citizen, once went on her television show and said she would never eat another hamburger as a result of the mad cow scare. And she, however, was taken to court by the Texas Cattlemen's Association, and ultimately she won the libel lawsuit, but it cost her $1 million. And unfortunately, not everybody has $1 million to spend on court costs. And so usually the powerful can just defeat citizens through court proceedings by basically draining them of their resources, even when there's no case. So the question is, can citizens and scientists work together in a responsible way to solve problems, or will powerful interests always obscure and harm that process? And that, of course, gets us back to discussion of knowledge and trust. In the scheme of things, we need to look at how democracy functions around this notion of risk dialogue. So the calculation of risk, as we've said, is at best an imperfect science. We really don't always know. Sometimes, of course, maybe these drug companies knew the risks. They took their chances out of desire to make money. Who knows? But essentially, even assuming goodwill, even their best projections, they could have just made a mistake, right? So risk dialogue requires public input. If the calculation of risk is imperfect, then that should be conveyed to the public. And then decisions about whether to proceed should be made collectively rather than by a few powerful interest groups, right? So the question is, which experts can be trusted for this conversation, and what are the potentials for what we call knowledge gaps, right? So a vertical knowledge gap is information not communicated up and down across the levels of society's hierarchies. And of course, in this case, we're talking about expertise. So at the top here, we mean expert scientists probably, and at the bottom, your less informed citizens. And unfortunately, these gaps can emerge when there's a deliberate suppression of information on the part of scientists or industry members who control the communication of science. In any case, these vertical knowledge gaps can stop the rational flow of information from expert to citizen. Horizontal knowledge gaps happen sideways. They're not up and down. So this would be, for instance, between scientists. So you have, of course, in the case of climate change, some scientists who typically work for oil companies and so forth who deny that it exists, and then you have 97% of scientists who say that it does who don't have any such affiliations. And other examples of this we've seen historically, tobacco corporations used to essentially buy scientists to say that their studies were inconclusive, that we weren't sure if smoking was bad for you, and yada, yada, yada. And we all know how that turned out, right? So the problem is with a lot of these risks that are taken, and here we usually can't ignore the treadmill of production as kind of a background variable here, because face it, that's why a lot of risks are taken, is in the interest of making profit. Nothing risked, nothing ventured, nothing gained, right? So private interests, industries in general, are generally the ones pushing environmentally risky behavior in the hopes of achieving some kind of economic gain. So in other words, the gains are going to be privately experienced, but the risks and the damage is going to be publicly experienced, right? So the public is being asked to tolerate this risky behavior for the sake of a small interest experiencing some gains, right? So it seems like a pretty lopsided equation, right? All the risk going to the many, all the rewards going to the few. Now, if we think about Dewey, who made some interesting statements about this whole phenomenon of complex technical problems and the process of democracy, says the following: the questions involved, questions of science, agriculture, industry, and finance, are highly technical. How many voters are competent to measure all the factors involved in arriving at a decision? And if they were competent after studying it, how many have the time to devote to it, right? So even if you did have the expertise, could you actually even devote the time to studying it? And, this is the crux of the problem. How do we make democratic decisions about things we don't fully understand without relying on experts who could fall prey to propaganda and to being corrupted, right? So Dewey goes on and says public apathy, which is a lack of political engagement, may result from this problem. People essentially understand this situation, right? That there's a convoluted communication flow. Secrecy, prejudice, bias, misrepresentation, and propaganda, as well as sheer ignorance, are at play. So what does he say? We need free and full intercommunication between experts and citizens, which means we've got to cut away the propaganda. We've got to cut away this convolution of information. It's not required that all citizens require every technical detail to weigh in, but they do need to be able to trust experts to give them reliable and informed information, right? So that, as Dewey says, what is required is that they have the ability to judge of the bearing of the knowledge supplied by others upon common concerns, and those others, of course, are the experts, usually scientists of some kind. So getting back to this notion of rational risk assessment, which we were talking about earlier as the dominant model for the EPA and similar agencies around the world dealing with environmental risks, Brian Norton, a former employee of the EPA, actually proposes a pragmatic alternative called adaptive management, which essentially assumes that we don't know all the information, that after we make a decision, and if it becomes clear we made a miscalculation, we should adapt our policies, right? And that's going to involve a lot of public input. We're going to have to take a look at public values and not ignore them. And it's going to require continual monitoring and evaluation. And that's really quite different than the rational risk assessment model, but could potentially lead to a more logical future, given the circumstances of living in a risk society. So a functioning risk dialogue, then, in summary, is free and clear communication between science and the public, as noted by Dewey, removal of misrepresentation and propaganda, or all incentives toward them, as noted by treadmill of production scholars. It involves the inclusion of values in the discussion of risk, as is suggested by adaptive management in the work of Norton, and the balancing of the equity of risk and reward. It's unfair to ask the risk be taken on by the public and the reward be given to a small interest group. And that essentially concludes our discussion of the individual Rationality and risk. Thanks for watching.